at all inside the mission-driven organization.
Hello and welcome to what I think is going to be an absolutely scintillating conversation. I'm a little biased, of course, because I'm obsessed with some of these topics, but I think you'll find it is going to be really, really interesting. My name is Michael Casey. I'm the Chief Content Officer of CoinDesk, which is the leading publication covering cryptocurrencies, digital assets, and blockchain technology. I'm going to, first of all, introduce this tremendous panel. To my left is Danelle Dixon, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Stellar Foundation, Anthony Scaramucci, who is the founder of Skybridge Capital, Brett Harrison, the President of FTX US, Lauren Woodman, the Executive Director of DataKind, and last but not least, Robert Wardrop, the founder and Director of the Cambridge Centre for Alternative Finance. A really interesting array of perspectives. You'll see why in a minute. We've got, somebody who runs and looks after a foundation dealing with a specific protocol. We've got an investor. We've got an exchange. We have a data scientist, and we have an academic who's been doing some tremendous work actually measuring this stuff. And we're going to be talking about some big issues, right? Everybody often talks about the energy consumption of Bitcoin and crypto, and there's a lot of big things that get thrown around, and there's a lot of confusion and passion. And we'll talk about where that all sits and what the trade-off between value and expenditure is, and what we're talking about when we talk about consuming energy. But we'll also talk about the fact that cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology, beyond having this bigger question about their own place in sustainability as technologies that consume energy at a certain rate, can play a role in actually being a force multiplier, a driver of some of the big challenges and fixing some of the issues in terms of sustainability. So it's an interesting, ranging discussion, and hopefully we'll be able to do this in a way that is coherent and informative for you all. But I thought I'd just throw to you first, Robert, because the starting point for any of these conversations is data. And your centre does as good a work as anyone, by far, I would say, in sort of trying to measure this otherwise difficult aspect of how much energy is consumed and what it looks like, what type of energy is consumed. So
yeah,
what have you learned?
Yeah, so we got into this because we published empirical data about just the development and the growth of kind of mining activity. And if you want to understand energy use, you really need to understand where the mining's happening. And so because Cambridge had a pretty trusted name, and we produce empirical data. So there were several mining pools gave us exclusive access to data where we could get a sense of where the mining activity was happening. And in 2018, we realized, wow, I mean, if Bitcoin continues to develop, this energy issue is going to be substantive, right? People are going to really want to understand, and we're beginning to see the debate and the conflict emerge with different people on different sides. And so what we began to do is, in measuring the mining, come up with an estimate of electricity consumption. So if you go to ccf.io, it's one of the most cited indexes in real time for what electricity use of the Bitcoin proof of work is. And today we would estimate in terms of sort of energy use, it would be about 0.18% of the world's sort of energy production. And from we now sort of approaching greenhouse gas estimates of emissions, which would be about 0.13%. Now within that, because of the mining maps, we have a sense also of how much of that's renewable, how much of that is non-renewable. And we're able to sort of watch how mining moves around. So 2 years ago, actually quite a lot was hydro. You had patterns in China of seasonal migration between winter and summer, summer going south, putting mining machines on trucks and moving it back and forth. So you could actually get a sense of what was feeding it, but probably renewables were maybe half, actually, of the energy used in proof of work. Interestingly, since the China ban on mining and the migration of a lot of mining to the United States, gas has increased significantly as a source of this energy. And so in relative proportion, renewables are actually down to 40%. Now, we reported last week there's surreptitious activity that's gone back into China despite the ban, which is probably around 20%, we estimate. And so you may see another shift happen, right, shortly as that sort of a surreptitious activity is happening. But the consequences of material, we estimate that if it was hydro only, you could cut, right, the current, greenhouse gas emission by, 24 times. If it was, and we use that hydro as kind of the lower bound, upper bound being coal, which would be roughly a double from the current level. So there's a lot of opportunity on the downside, and I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of stuff there, right? Because often the immediate response to some of this data say, oh my goodness, this is as much consumption as Sweden. I mean, it keeps changing. These
Argentina today.
Argentina's the latest one, isn't it? Okay. So, and that means something big and scary and everything else. But of course, that also raises this question, Danelle, I'll throw this to you. Is like, okay, great. So a lot of energy. I always like to look at that classic satellite image of the Korean Peninsula, and you can see this very stark difference at nighttime between the very, very dark north and the fully lit, illuminated south. One part of that peninsula is consuming a lot of energy, the other one is not. And the question, of course, is which one do you want to live in, right? And the point there is really, okay, energy itself is not inherently bad, right? But there's a question, is it used for something valuable? How do you guys approach that in terms of the way you think about
Well, I think
this?
there's a couple of things, but the first thing I'll say is that it's important to understand like the baseline, right? And I think that's what Robert gave us in terms of the baseline with respect to certainly the proof of work mechanism. There are other consensus mechanisms, and I think it's important to understand their baseline too. We just worked with PwC, and PwC is put together a framework for how to think about it. And you think about it as carbon output and then also an energy usage. And that's how they put together the framework that we looked at. And we certainly looked at Stellar to say, well, so what does that mean for us? And we did that not because we think our way is the right way and Bitcoin is the wrong way, but just because I think the baseline and the framework is important to create that notion of transparency and ability for everyone to think about how they can improve things. And so for us, it comes out that the network usage for the year is the equivalent to 33.7, the electricity use from 33.7 homes in the US. That was an important factor for us because then you can think about carbon offsets and you can think about how you can do that and we're certainly going to work with to be able to do that with the whole network. But the important thing is that to not make that value judgment about that one is bad and one is good. It's to say, how can we make all of it better? And whether that's through carbon offset or whether that's through putting these brilliant minds that have figured out this amazing technology to work on figuring out how you can use this technology and make it more sustainable. And I think that's where we're seeing the industry move, and that's what I think is really great about it.
But Lauren, it's incredibly complex, trying to figure out where the pros and cons are, because as Danelle was just saying, there's some real positive use cases that come from that technology. And the uses of it, you're a data scientist, how we actually verify data, and we can use that in powerful ways to make the world better and more sustainable. But at the same time, there's so many moving parts here. So how do we approach this as a society?
Yeah, there are moving parts. And, look, in our work, we work primarily with mission-driven organizations. And I don't think it's a revelation to say mission-driven organizations are usually behind when it comes to technology adoption. And so we know where there are really promising use cases, whether it's tracking land rights with the blockchain or leveraging cryptocurrencies for populations that are at risk and don't want to be or need alternative ways to purchase and consume. There's also a lot of organizations that are looking at what the environmental impact is. And so I think, to Danielle's point, there are trade-offs involved, and we really have to think about what those are. And as quickly as all of this is moving, it is very easy to leave behind the mission-driven organizations and say, we'll come back to that. And we think that it's really important for us to look at that in the context of all of the advances that are being made. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, get everybody to the table, right? That seems to be a critical thing. And that's just reminded me that I need to acknowledge the fact that this event has been spearheaded, this particular panel, by CISA. If you guys don't know what that is, you should check it out. It's the Crypto Impact Sustainability Accelerator, and I've been involved in it right from the start. And the idea behind CISA was, and the fact that it is actually at the WEF, is that this would be a body where all these stakeholders, because the WEF has convening power like nobody else, right? That every stakeholder needed to be at the table to discuss what the impact and opportunities of crypto would be in terms of sustainability. So anybody's interested, you can have a word to Aveen over here, who looks after CISA for us. So, Brett, I thought I'd throw to you now because we've been talking, Danelle alluded to it, right? There's proof of work, there's proof of stake, very different energy consumption profiles. As an exchange, you've got an interesting sort of perspective on how much of the crypto world, right, broadly, because there's a whole other level of confusion about Bitcoin, crypto, everything else. Within the broader world of cryptocurrencies, how much is either, and what does that mean for the energy profiles of the different tokens?
Sure. So it's very important, as you say, to scope this conversation about energy usage to proof of work blockchains, because the other alternative consensus mechanisms, proof of stake, proof of history, different kinds of consensus mechanisms, don't have anywhere near the same energy consumption as proof of work. Again, not to make a value judgment on proof of work, proof of stake, and other things. That's just the way it is. So for example, on the Solana blockchain, a single transaction is about the same energy usage as sending one email or 2 Google searches. So it's an irrelevant amount of energy. So we, as an exchange, really get to see the development of these different blockchains over time and how they're being used. And it's just the case that so much more transaction volume now is happening on these alternative layer 1, layer 2 technologies than ever been before. So for example, on FTX, more than 3 times the transactions of Bitcoin are happening in proof of stake mechanisms. And so we see our customers are actually moving in that direction. And just looking at those transactions they're doing, we're able to measure the total offsets we might have as an exchange, purchase carbon offsets to offset that, even if it doesn't move further in the direction of more proof of stake mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. So Anthony, as an investor in this, right, and you've obviously, I'm sure, fully responsible in the way you look upon what your investing profile is, your portfolio, you've got ESG goals that you probably would want to meet. How do you look at all this, and what's the important metrics that you would like to be drawing from this to be able to figure out what a sustainable portfolio of crypto assets would look like?
Well, I mean, the first thing that we did was we bought carbon offsets. We figured out what the size was of our portfolio, the energy consumption of everything, and we bought carbon offsets. That was an immediate thing that we did. Obviously, that's not enough, and some people will say, well, that's virtue signaling. So it's not like we did it just for that reason. We did it to make a statement that as the Bitcoin Mining Council and people like FTX are getting involved, we want to see a reduction in energy. But where I find myself sitting is in meetings with traditional finance, because I'm getting old now, so I'm got 1 foot in DeFi and 1 foot in TradeFi, and the energy consumption in traditional finance is just overwhelming. Okay, let's take my 85-year-old mother who's still driving her carbon-emitting car to the branch of Chase, and she's waiting online, and the teller's taking their carbon-emitting car, and they're cooling off the branch in the summer, and they're heating it in the winter, and it's just massive explosion of carbon. So what this is going to provide, if we get this right, is the future where we're not going to be doing all that. And so you're going to be delayering the economy and having a massive reduction in carbon. So what I don't want to have happen is we overly focus on the carbon emission, but not the offset, which is all the traditional finance we won't have to do anymore. And that's what I'm hoping to focus some of my energy on.
Isn't this another thing to think about? Like what you just talked about were things that you would never necessarily add in to. Like you wouldn't think about driving the car, you wouldn't add that in. The thing that's awesome about blockchain is that you can see all the transactions that are happening, and the transparency standard that blockchain creates with respect to sustainability is very different than anything out there, because nobody's going to tell you how many hours they leave their refrigerator door open. And so I think that this is the thing that you can see that's different with using blockchain versus, and with thinking about how we can get blockchain to be more sustainable, because we actually have immutable records.
You know, Anthony mentioned the Bitcoin Mining Council, Robert, and that was an initiative that we saw amongst a number of large US mining companies to say we are committed to renewables-based mining. And that just brings us to this really interesting discussion about what role Bitcoin mining could play. Right? It's a bit of a flip in the debate. People see it as bad, but actually it could be a force multiplier. Right? It could be out there, not just using renewable energy, but actually being an underwriter of renewable projects around the world. I mean, what does that look like? I mean, is there real potential in that? But you were talking, it's rather complicated.
Well, it is, and I think look, there's different levels. One level, is somewhat ideological. Look, I'm a sociologist, right? And there's a view that would be we're in a period of institutional change, right? And if I had lunch with a central banker today, right, who was sitting near me. We were talking about the value of the independence of central banks, right? Your balance sheets get bigger, and I think some people would say, what is trust worth, right? And the central bank, if you're young and you're looking at your pension, and someone else at our table was saying, well, I'm not sure I trust the pension whoever provides my pension to actually deliver that. And so I'm doing different things with my money, and I'm prepared to trust technology. Now, we're trusting technology, but then we're trusting what the governance of that technology is in terms of, again, proof of work versus proof of wake and things. And they'll all exist, I think. And you'll have horses for courses. So I think, how much are we willing for a given use case to, frankly, trust more centralization versus sort of a very extreme of decentralization, sort of autonomously governed. And so I think, finding the use cases around, and I think, you would probably, I think, see a variety of these things emerging, where you're seeing a similar approach of a mosaic that's likely to have a number of these things survive with different consensus mechanisms.
So, I mean, one of the things that people talk about as a way in which Bitcoin can be or could be this driver, right, is that in a certain city that has a source of renewable energy, they'll come in, underwrite that, build it. They'll also help to manage the sort of supply and demand, the big variability that happens when you have a solar addition to a grid. But we've seen in the US some cities where Bitcoin miners have come in and these sorts of promises, but in fact, there's enough of a problem with the grid that essentially what it does is consume and monopolize the consumption of that energy, and it drives up the prices of residents. So there's a real trade-off here, but So
I mean, that's the problem with global numbers, right? Like we complete, like transparency. Among our panel, we've talked about the importance of transparency, and why blockchain is so valuable in terms of that transparency. We're very transparent in terms of our methodology, and so if you have a better way to calculate this, then please tell us.
Right.
Because the global average is very deceptive.
Well,
because what you get is that mining
places,
concentration.
Right? Yeah. But Laura, maybe you could speak to this, because I think that there is real potential perhaps in a lot of you said the global south. There is all of these places that have a lot of renewable energy for whom bringing in a deep-pocketed institution that could come in and fund the development of hydro or wind power or solar in these places and give them energy autonomy could be a very positive thing, right? But how do we get that conversation moving in that direction?
Yeah, there's certainly a potential there, and we have seen that in other scenarios, right? There are so many places where the financing for infrastructure development just doesn't exist. But if you have an organization, a mining concentration, where you're going to have a reliable energy customer, then all of a sudden those investments make a lot more sense. And it gives us the opportunity to do that. We have seen that work with telecommunications infrastructure, where we've seen it work with nonprofits that we know are going to be there for 4 or 5 years. They're going to be telecom consumers, and we can use them as anchor clients to build out infrastructure and bring services to rural communities. There's certainly the opportunity to do the same with renewable energy and build out those capacities in currently underserved markets.
Mm-hmm. And it's also beyond environmental use cases. It seems there's just these things are inherently connected to issues around inclusion and some of the social parts of this, which I think is a big mission of Stella's as well, right? So,
right. I mean, that's the whole part, is that and also I think it's really important that while lots of consensus mechanisms exist, I think we need to really think about like all the value that they drive, and there are different networks for different things. Like lots of folks they use Bitcoin for a store of value. There's Lightning that's going to take a lot of this off. The payments even will come off of Bitcoin, and you won't have to settle very often. So that's going to limit the carbon output there. And then other consensus mechanisms we like to call ours proof of agreement. There's many out there that would be similar. They don't actually have that kind of the impact, and there's still tons of value. From our standpoint, we look at it that our mission is creating equitable access to the global financial system. We do that by focusing on cross-border transactions. We do that by focusing on trying to deliver an opportunity for those that are de-risked from banking infrastructure to be able to get access to wallets and provide access to these digital assets that exist. That's awesome, and that's what blockchain can do. So there is that value.
Responsible regulation in this industry is so important, and it's true in Bitcoin mining, it's true in crypto exchanges in general, because what happens if you have some cases where Bitcoin mining is a force for good, helping to stabilize a renewable grid, some cases where it's a force for bad, where it's driving up energy prices in a local town. If in response to the bad, you just outright ban it, then you don't have the chance to regulate it responsibly, and it moves somewhere else. And this is exactly what we saw with China. When China banned Bitcoin mining, it moved immediately. Part of it moved to America, where it was split between renewables, but also natural gas. A lot of it moved to Kazakhstan, where it was powered by coal, which was much worse than the hydro that was happening in China. And so it was, instead of an opportunity to be able to actually regulate it appropriately with good policy and make sure that it is moving in the direction of 100% renewables and it's not stealing energy from a grid from places where the local citizens might not be able to say, afford the energy otherwise, it just sort of moves somewhere else.
Yeah, I believe that was probably a factor in the fact that the EU law that was going to ban proof of work mining eventually didn't get through, but it was a knife edge vote there, right? It may well have actually banned proof of work on those grounds and led to the kind of fallout that you're referring to. But Anthony, you have the ear of a number of regulators. I mean, how aware are they of this? I mean, what do you feel like policymakers, are they starting to grasp these issues?
I think they're starting to. I think that the guys at FTX, others, Coinbase, et cetera, they've done a very good job of explaining it. The lobbying community now, at least in Washington, is fairly large. And of course, the politicians are very worried about the tens of millions of people that own these cryptocurrencies. And so it reminds me a little bit of Uber. If you remember, nobody wanted Uber. No regulator, no politician, no state or local authority wanted Uber. But who wanted Uber were the people. And so I think the people are there now in cryptocurrency, and I think the politicians, at least in the Western democracies, will follow. But I guess I just have a quick question for Professor Walter. Are we accounting for things properly? And what I mean by that is, use the example of the bank teller, or let's say that we have a cost savings associated with expatriates sending money back to their families in El Salvador. The El Salvadoran government saying that could be potentially $400 million of savings not going through a MoneyGram or a Western Union. And is there positive externalities that happen as a result of the blockchain
There
that
are.
actually
It's a
positively
great point.
affect the environment? Do we need to broaden the way we
We do,
account it?
and I would say
Account for
that's
it?
a major area of where research is going to go. Because look, we're peeling the onion here, okay? So we formed a digital asset research program with 16 founding members about 8 weeks ago, right? That's really interesting. The IMF, it's the BIS, the Bank for International, Inter-American Development Bank in Latin America, but it's also Goldman, MSCI, Visa, MasterCard, because they're all understanding that this needs to be understood because we can't price it correctly otherwise. And if you're investors, you want to demystify this because you're an intermediary. You've got to turn around who's got the capital. You have to be able to present this credibly. And they're actually funding a 2-year program to start to get exactly at some of these issues.
But in fact, it may be that blockchain technology, even though it is presenting these complications in terms of the measurement of its impact, is in fact a part of the solution, right? It gives you that
Correct.
persistent data. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, Lauren, the idea that you could apply these technologies to, the big problem with climate change, as I see it, is the tragedy of the commons. There is no one in charge, and nobody trusts each other because the data is coming from multiple sources. We need some way to get consistent, measurable, and traceable data right through supply chains. And there's a lot of capacity there in blockchain. There are a lot of people building those sorts of solutions.
There are, and I think that transparency is critical for us in establishing trust that we are making progress against the goals that we've set out. I mean, there's been lots of conversations about trust and what are the elements of trust, but when you get right down to it, transparency becomes that critical piece. And those technologies do allow us to account for, what we are actually expending and what the actual costs are, to be transparent about that, and then to start looking at things and say, okay, where can we improve? What are the externalities that we are not accounting for and we should be accounting for? And be able to know whether or not we are making progress and identify priority areas for us to make progress as we move towards 2030.
So interesting, I was thinking as I was listening to Lauren and others here, Brett, that, there's a real conversation here about how we need to bring all the stakeholders together and sort of get this together, understand the whole thing. And I'm immediately thinking of the crypto communities who are like tribes and against each other. And this conversation about proof of work versus proof of stake, it's all very well for us to sit here and just say, oh, look, this is variety. But there's a lot of very impassioned people who believe that one is good and the other is bad. How do we deal with that? Can we ever resolve the huge debates that go on about not so much the environment, but the actual efficacy of each of these different consensus mechanisms to give security and underpin these protocols.
So I think what you see, especially online, places like Twitter, in the discussions over these different consensus mechanisms, is not too different from what you see in any kind of political debates, where you see a very vocal minority sort of obscuring the silent majority about these issues, which is that all of us, or most of us in the crypto community, want this technology to develop responsibly. We don't want to necessarily pick winners and losers off the bat. We'd like it to develop, see where it goes, let the market kind of pick what's ultimately going to be the best serving for the technology and for the users. And then as we grow it, do so responsibly in a way that protects consumers, yes, but also is responsibly using energy. And I think that what we as companies, all the companies here, on stage, but also our, biggest competitors in the space as well, have been trying to work together more to develop a unified message about what we think is important to regulators to make sure it gets done, and not to sow such seeds of discord on Twitter and these sorts of forums against each other over these kind of religious debates over proof of work versus proof of stake, for example.
Can I just say that it's so important that I suppose it's important that those debates exist for some folks because they just need to have that. But the truth of the matter is, if we actually do end up picking a winner, then you sort of eliminate the value of what blockchain was set out to do. Because the whole point is, with the underpinnings of the internet, we actually set it up so that there was interoperability and standards. That's why it's so awesome. That's why we had those 2 years with the pandemic where we actually got to do Zoom or whatever other platform that you utilized during that. It's because we had interoperability and decentralization. What blockchain set out to do was to do that and to eliminate borders. So if we continue to have these battles and there is this one winner that picked, we're going to end up with the exact same content. The web on the content side, what we have is we have 5 winners. Do we want that? No. We actually want it so that there's interoperability amongst all of the blockchains, so that we can actually have multi-chain, multi-asset. We can have standards that are created so we can all work in this environment. There doesn't have to be a winner. And in fact, if there does, we end up with the exact same financial system that we have today, which is completely broken.
It's a great point. But Anthony, at the same time, this tribalism and the kind of, as much as it is a minority, they're the loudest ones in the room. And investors like yourselves, but I would say newcomers who haven't done the homework like you, it's very confusing, right? It's also confusing for regulators and others to sort of make sense of all that noise. I mean, what's the best way for somebody to sort of try to process all of that stuff?
Well, listen, for me, we're in like covered wagon territory. Somebody asked me, what inning are we in? It feels like we haven't even broke from spring training. Not to use a baseball metaphor here in Europe, but the point I'm making is that we are so early that it's impossible to really figure out who the winners are. But I love what you just said about decentralization. What do we know about decentralization? There's anti-fragility in decentralization, and there's fairness in decentralization. There's also accuracy. There's a project that a couple of my friends are working on called truflation.com. So you could look it up. It's truflation.com. Over the blockchain, they're taking a data feed from a number of different places, and they're coming up with an actual inflation number. Not the Fed's number, not the Bank of England's number, not the CPI, because we all know there are lies and damn lies in statistics, but this is truflation. And this is the properties that we're dealing with right now. This is the scientific innovation where we're going to be able to come together as each individual people working in a decentralized way to get more fairness, more accuracy, more egalitarianism. So I truly hope what you just said happens, that we don't end up with a Google, an Amazon, and a Microsoft. I hope we have this disparate group that's functioning and doing quite well.
The fact that Anthony just talked about inflation, right? Let's just take this conversation to a level that deals with this current macro environment.
You may not want to look at truflation.com, by the way, because the numbers are quite scary, but that's a separate topic.
But to Robert's point, to get the data straight, we can start to fix the problems, right? Look, we are living in a uniquely difficult moment. And climate change is the one that's been with us for a while. It's the new stuff. It's the pandemic. It's a war. It's refugee crises. It's a massive issue. And in the midst of this new technology is emerging and sort of just taking on forces that are very difficult to control. And I think it's scaring a lot of people. We've seen some policymakers, some in the US, a particular head of a rather large European central bank a day ago, saying that this stuff is worthless. How do we sort of
Charlie
deal with this
Munger
moment?
called it venereal disease, so I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Venereal disease perhaps isn't.
Yeah. So there you go. But I'd love to sort of just move it to that if we can. People have any opinions on how we sort of bring this conversation about this critical technology that is not going away and place it into these bigger debates that are happening about the future of the world. I don't know.
One of the things that we do, look, we saw this as a problem, particularly policymakers and regulators, and just a lack of really fundamental understanding. I mean, before you even get into consensus mechanisms, I mean, at a super basic level, right? And so we developed a course in 2018 called FinTech and Regulatory Innovation. It's only for ministers of finance, policymaking employees, or financial services regulators around the world. No one from industry. That's it, right? Now, we've had 9 cohorts, 8-week program, tutor groups, capstone projects, coaches on how regulatory framework innovation, understand how to break down business models, 1,450 regulators from 135 countries and 310 regulatory authorities. And then cohort 10 is about to start. And it's having a huge impact. 500 capstone projects, many have been CBDC, stablecoin, cryptos, trying to understand a regulatory framework, and all over the world. And what we see happening is they're collaborating on these projects. So what you see is Kazakhstan, someone is in a tutorial group with someone from Oman. And they have a common
Mr. Nell's
problem.
decentralized model working
It's
in the
a
policymaking
decentralized
space.
model. And it's this, because the international dialogue, the institutional structures of calling quarterly meetings, where you're going to have a working group, where regulators are going to get together and talk about what's happening in crypto, it just doesn't move fast enough.
Yeah. Brad, I'd love to hear your thoughts, because I know that obviously you have to talk to regulators. And so, yeah, what's your take on this?
So I think the most important thing we have to do as practitioners of blockchain technology is to tell the actual stories of the ways that blockchain is being used. And I think, crypto for a long time has said that, global remittances and cross-border payments is one of the biggest applications of crypto. And many, regulators and policymakers have said, well, I don't see it yet. Where is that happening? And then what happens? Russia invaded Ukraine, and we saw over 100 million of crypto assets donated directly to the Ukrainian government. In fact, the Ukrainian government reached out to FTX to set up an account with us, and KYCing Ukraine was pretty fun. And, and we helped convert tens of millions of worth of crypto assets to US dollars to send them via SWIFT. And that happened from people in over 100 countries who didn't have to figure out how they can wire through SWIFT to get to the Ukrainian government out from wherever their local payment system was. They were able to do it immediately for almost no fee using crypto. And so I think we see sort of in real time the actual story of the utility of crypto playing out, and people have to see that and experience that firsthand to really believe that this is worth pursuing.
That's totally a fascinating moment for this to be happening. Let's open up to questions. Christian.
Thank you so much, Christian Lang, TradeShift. Look, I'm a huge fan of a lot of the new consensus mechanisms, ETH, Solar, all of these. I think proof of stake, and you mentioned a lot of the others are great, but I do really wonder why there's not more skepticism or a sort of hardcore reality around proof of work. I mean, the numbers are pretty insane, and I think we talk about externalities, right? I think we tend to forget that, you mentioned the size of Argentina, right? Argentina provide mostly housing, education, food, cars, jobs for 45 million people. Bitcoin have around 1.2 million daily active wallets, right? And what are those wallets doing? They're mostly a store of value, right? And I think my question is really, are we thinking hard enough about the opportunity cost? Because the other thing is, all of that work is not just energy, it's compute cycles. We could probably solve cancer 4 times over folding proteins with that amount of compute. So the question really here is, I think, are we thinking hard enough about the opportunity cost? Are we being real about, do we want to spend the energy of one country storing value for, around 1.2 million daily users? I mean, I can never in the history of computing think about we've gone backwards this much. And I would say if we didn't have any alternative technologies, if we didn't have any alternatives to this, but we do, we have so many alternatives now. So why is it so bad if regulators want to ban proof of work? What's good about proof of work?
Well, first of all, I think the answer to your question is no. We haven't actually been able to assess the opportunity cost because we don't have the methodology yet to be able to assess the value.
We know it's teraflops.
But I'm saying the value on the other side. But I think so the answer to your question is no. But I think the real question is, if you ban it in one region, won't it just show up in the other regions? And so, well, I mean, the realistic thing the realism of that happening is probably pretty low. And I think that rather than, you could focus there, and I think it's really good to be able to get that value and to understand the opportunity cost.
Mostly banned gasoline cars globally from 2040.
Yeah, but we're sliding. But we're sliding into the value discussion, and it's highly subjective. There's a lot of people that think that's fabulous value.
But that's the part that we don't have yet, is the value
and
part.
I'll also say that compute cycles are not a scarce resource. It's never like, oh, hey, I really like to solve this deep learning problem. Oh, we were out of compute cycles in Google because of Bitcoin. It just doesn't happen right now.
But the value of trust is socially constructed. And that's the problem here, right? What's that trust production worth? And that's pretty subjective. And I don't think we've landed on that.
Isn't it a political discussion? It's like it's not something. It's only consensus that gets us to that idea of value. Yes.
And I think that your point, though, is should we be critical? We absolutely should be.
Yeah.
But then we also should think of the value on the one side, and then also be critical about whether we are putting our energy and attention on making and using the store of the green energy and figuring out where that can actually balance. So I think we're not doing all of those things, and we should.
I knew this question was going to spark a big discussion because it is at the heart of everything, and it's such a good question and a lot of great answers. But we really should let some other people in. Yes, sir. Do we have a microphone at the back there, please?
Jeremy Garrett-Costa was from the UK. It was really just a follow-on from that. Whether it should be regulated or not, I don't have a particular view on, but it certainly ain't responsible. And if as an entity people want to be responsible, this is like creating a new industry, finding out that the first thing was coal mining, and then deciding it's still a good idea to carry on mining coal.
You know, I'd like to hear what your response, because I think I know what's going to be to that.
So walk me through gold. Walk me through gold.
It has a similar
more energy
to Bitcoin.
Same thing. I agree.
So we should ban gold too.
I didn't say ban. I said I wasn't saying regulating out of it. No, I said I disagree with that. But I think things need to be responsible, and that should be the driver.
I think if you
think you're a brand new industry, this is a brand new industry, and I think it's wonderful, and I think there are great, really fantastic uses for it. But most of them revolve around the much lighter energy consumptive uses. I'm not talking about the actual energy consumption, but the actual uses for that. Immutable audit trails and all of that is a fantastic use.
I don't think you're wrong. And I think that's the point. The point is I don't think we have the research sufficient. Like, we haven't been critical enough. And I think that's right.
I think also all of us on stage, I think, are in favor of responsible regulation for the Bitcoin mining industry, which doesn't mean banning. It doesn't mean letting it all go unregulated. It means figuring out how to continue the current positive push towards 100% renewable, reduction in energy production, a general move towards better consensus mechanisms, things like wrapping Bitcoin on other chains, which is getting more and more popular. I think these are all things that can help trend in the correct direction.
Let's call another question. I'm sure there's somebody else who wants to have something at the middle row there, and then this lady here.
Hi, Charles Dallingpole from Compara Advantage. I'm interested in your view as to whether or not the issue of sanctions, money laundering, and terrorist financing is a bigger threat to crypto than energy.
Who wants to take that?
Sorry, what was the question?
Whether or not sanctions, evasion, money laundering, and terrorist financing is a bigger threat to crypto than energy.
Sure, yeah, happy to take this. We wrote a pretty big piece about the claim that crypto is being used to evade sanctions. And so here's one statistic I give a lot for this particular question. So last year, OFAC sanctioned the first ever crypto exchange to be sanctioned. It was SUEX. And in the month prior to the sanction, SUEX was moving around 2 billion crypto a month in dollar terms. In the month following the sanction, they moved around $15,000 worth of crypto. And now they move zero. They're gone. Sanctions are incredibly effective at stopping crypto. Why? Because you can't actually do crypto transactions without getting fiat into the system. That happens through exchanges. All the exchanges use systems like Chainalysis, TRM Labs, to be able to track the web of unhosted wallets. And therefore, it is very, very difficult. In fact, I would say it's much better if someone tries to evade sanctions through crypto than through taking cash in a briefcase or melting gold, because we can actually track it. It's fully transparent, and there's incredibly developed software to be able to do so.
Okay, there's a question in the front row, I believe, here.
Hi, I think also you're dealing with a technology problem, with an ecosystem problem, because crypto is taking so much heat over the energy issue. But we're also dealing with a whole ecosystem shift with the change in quantum computing that is bringing. So how much responsibility is also that kind of shift in technology is bringing into the table? Because most of our crypto computations that are happening, they're not going to happen in quantum computing. Although the claim that quantum computing is going to reduce energy by also requiring more energy for the cooling process of the quantum computing as well. So I think we need an ecosystem shift. The way we build technology should be different, because if our prime goal is energy efficient or energy efficient computations across board or transactions across board, then the way we build technology should be 100% different. Because if quantum computing came into play, most of the crypto that your crypto world is based on, 80% to 70% on, and my name is Huella Al-Khazemi, I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself, I'm a cryptographer, is going to be obsolete. It's going to be attackable.
But so, there's so many models of consensus that don't use the same level of energy, and I think that's so they're not being it's just we have to look at them all. Sometimes we just loop them all in to be the same, and they're very different.
But it's an interesting question, because I was on a panel yesterday with a guy called Jack Hadari. You might know of this gentleman who is really pushing hard for the idea that there's a new quantum standard that's going to be applied. And he threw the question of sustainability in crypto on its head, and he said, really, it's the sustainability of blockchains themselves, right? That you have this technology, and we think it's really valuable. If you don't get ready and upgrade your SHA-256, consensus algorithm,
100%.
you are going to be destroyed. Right. And what's the value of that, right? So it's a whole other way of thinking about it. But I'd love to, Brett, maybe.
Just one response that I hear often is, you go to 256, and then you go to 512, and then you go 124. It just keeps ramping up. So you will continue to have to invest. It's a pay to play game, right?
Sure. But that's the world of crypto. You're based on a world of crypto where it's a progressive control of improving security one step at a time. It's not a silver bullet. You will never have a silver bullet that will solve all the solutions. So you need, from day one here, from this forum, we need to invest in a crypto for emerging technologies, where we build a different type of a crypto that could be solution to all of the problems that exist at the moment, and potentially dictate how we build quantum computing. Because at the moment, the chain of building this technology it's built for commercial use. It's not built for a mindful, sustainable use. So today we were on a session on digital economies, and the CEO of IBM made this statement saying that in 2025 we will have quantum-ready computing. And this is very concerning, because this is in less than 4 years. If quantum-ready computing will be put into play, what does it mean for the stability and the security for all of your...
So I'll say I totally agree with you, and I think that let's take it to something a little bit more fundamental in terms of what we all rely on, which is end-to-end encryption in general. Forget about cryptocurrencies. How important, how completely essential to our entire lives on the internet is the ability to send a message between one person and another person using end-to-end encryption, and how much would that completely fail if quantum computing became prevalent tomorrow? I think a lot of it, maybe all of it. And so I think the same sort of solutions we need for that problem, for the UK and the US to be able to exchange a message without someone in the middle being able to see that message, is very similar to the kinds of things we have to do to create a cryptographic signature method for a new blockchain. And so I think we will have to work together, the cryptographers, the blockchain technologists, all of us together, to make a solution for that.
I think the use of HTTPS every day and all the things that it's not just the governments, it's us with our bank accounts. So we're going to need to fix that problem.
The whole thing. All right, guys, we could have just gone on forever here. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for now. Quick, again, promo. Please check out the Crypto Impact Sustainability Accelerator, CISA, and if you want to talk about it, have a word to Aveen over here. A round of applause for this tremendous panel. Thank you so much, everybody.